Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar today on extreme heat and ecosystems. This is Greg Garfin. I'm the University Director of the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. And this is part of an ecosystem resilience webinar series that's being co-sponsored by the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, or Southwest CASC, and the University of Arizona Center for Climate Adaptation Science and Solutions. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, the Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center, Southwest CASC, was established in 2011 to provide objective scientific information, tools, and techniques that land, water, wildlife, and cultural resource managers and other interested parties can apply to anticipate, monitor, and adapt to climate change impacts in the southwestern US. The University of Arizona's Center for Climate Adaptation Science and Solutions, or CCASS, aims to strengthen and support adaptation, risk management, and resilience efforts at multiple scales by providing intellectual leadership, training, and engagement with a focus on solutions. And again, we've partnered for this webinar series. I'll just mention that the Southwest CASC is a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and a consortium of universities, plus the American Indian Higher Education Consortium here in the Southwest region. The University of Arizona is the host institution, and we have university or research institute partners at UC San Diego, UCLA, UC Davis, Desert Research Institute in Nevada, Utah State University, and Colorado State University. Today's speakers on extreme heat and ecosystems include Dr. David Breshears. He's Regents Professor in Natural Resources at the University of Arizona's School of Natural Resources and the Environment. He's well known for his work on western forests, forest dynamics, ecohydrology, and for tree mortality. And also Dr. Robbie Berger, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Arizona in bridging biodiversity and conservation science. And he is well known for his expansive transdisciplinary thinking about complex issues at the intersection between ecosystems and society. We will hear from our two speakers. We'll have time for question and answer, and then we will make some announcements about future webinars in this series. And I will hand this over now to Dave Breshears.
Okay, just a check there, Sarah. Can you hear me and see the slides?
We can hear you. I cannot see your slides yet.
Okay, I'm getting screen sharing has failed to start. Please try again later.
Okay, maybe X out of it and then try again.
Yep.
I'm happy to share them on my end if it doesn't work.
Yeah, same here.
Okay. Sorry about that. If you'll just bear with us for a sec, we'll be with you. We road tested this ahead of time and it worked just fine, but it's not working now. Let me try one more thing here.
There we go.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right. Sorry for the delay. Well, thank you. I'm really pleased to see so many people on here. I hope you're staying safe and not bouncing off the walls during this time at home. So I'm really excited that we've started this conversation, and that Southwest Climate Adaptation Science Center and CCASS, Center for Climate Adaptation and Science Solutions, have been facilitating a series of discussions. What I'm going to do today is just give a very short recap of an initial seminar we had March 18th, and also tie it in with sort of just a very quick background on my evolution of thinking to start being concerned about extreme heat or heat waves as ecosystem effects. We were talking about where do we need to go next in terms of ecosystems. And we already know quite a bit about, the wildfire issue risks are increasing dramatically. And we're seeing a lot of tree mortality and associated insect outbreaks. But one of the things that I think might be overlooked, and some recent research collaboration has raised concern for me on this, is that heat waves might be a more important thing than we've considered. And the other big uncertainty that we have is thinking about how systems respond after there's been a lot of change. So our March 18th seminar, we had briefly, we covered these topics: climatology, insects, fisheries, ecosystems, and human health. And today I'm going to give a recap of that. So if you missed it, that'll help give you the highlights. And if you did attend it, it'll help get your head back into that, so we can use this as sort of a continuation of that dialogue. And then Robbie Berger's going to be giving a talk about birds and mammals in this context, and including specifics about humans. And then where this leads to also is that the other big uncertainties we think in some of the systems, besides heat waves as a potential driver, along with the wildfire and the sort of general drought-related declines in forests that we're seeing, are how do ecosystems respond after we've had a very hard hit in one way or another. And so that's the focus of some upcoming seminars there. And I know Greg will highlight these again at the end. So just a quick overview of my thinking. I first started thinking about really large-scale ecosystem changes when I worked with Craig Allen looking at the 1950s drought. But in the 2000s, we had another drought, and it was extremely severe. This is a very widely used photo pair that Craig Allen took. So you can see during mortality, this is pinyon juniper woodland near Los Alamos, New Mexico. And there's a lot of tree die-off there. It's supposed to all look green, like the small photo in the center. And you can see how brown it is. So it's a really kind of shockingly extensive change. And after the foliage comes off, it becomes a little more apparent. This is what the landscape looked like there. So this photo pair that Craig Allen took from USGS has been very powerful in conveying what big changes look like and what we might be facing with, along with temperature being a concern. So this case study raised concern for me about thinking about drought and warmer temperature together. I moved to University of Arizona after that. We had an opportunity to do an experiment in Biosphere 2. This was led by my PhD student, Henry Adams, who I co-advised with Travis Huxman. Very simple design, and it was kind of what we call an oh-duh question. Does hotter drought kill trees faster? So we've got watered and unwatered trees in ambient temperature and 4 degrees warmer temperature. And not surprisingly, the trees under warmer temperature died substantially faster. So yes, the hotter drought kills trees faster. So this is sort of an evolution of the field work complemented with an experimental perspective to think about temperature. And then we wanted to know the next follow-up oh-duh question is, well, what happens if it keeps getting warmer and warmer? We just did one temperature increase. What's the shape of the response? Do trees die faster and faster with hotter drought? So in this experiment, there was a wide variety of temperatures, And this was for seedlings for both ponderosa pine and pinyon pine. And you can see on this graph on the bottom, there's the increase in temperature from 0 up to almost 8 degrees. And it's normalized to the change in the time to mortality, normalized by the ambient temperature. And you see some nice linear relationships there. You also see that the potted plant, the larger plant experiment in the triangle also kind of falls within the realm of the data that we saw here. The important message here is just that trees keep dying faster and faster as it gets warmer and warmer. The next kind of evolution of my thinking in temperature was really highlighted by this really nice work that colleagues in Western Australia completed. And we had been compiling, led by Craig Allen, a lot of information about tree die-off events around the world associated with temperature and drought. But Craig really highlighted the importance of, the Western Australia colleagues, led by George Matusik, really highlighted that a heat wave could kind of kick in and cause a big part of this. So they have large patches of B. grandis crowns rapidly discolored and died over periods as short as 5 days. Shortly following in February, many overstory and understory trees of 2 species discolored and died within 2 weeks. So they had a drought underlying this, but they could really see an effect of heat waves as a trigger. And then working with my colleagues, we went back and looked at this 2011 heat wave, and it turned out to be a very expansive heat wave that spanned both the marine system and the terrestrial system. So you can see the coast of Western Australia there, and some real temperature anomalies in terms of heat waves. And this triggered all kinds of things, which is where I really started thinking not just about tree die-off, but about ecosystem change. So this heat wave ended up impacting coral bleaching and tree die-off, so 2 major structural attributes of those systems, and other terrestrial plant mortality, seagrass and kelp loss, population crash in endangered bird species, plummeting breeding success in penguins, and outbreaks of terrestrial wood-boring insects. On this graph, what you can see briefly is that the main message is that there are decreases in both terrestrial and marine systems across different trophic levels. So you can see the pre and the post, and we had different metrics depending on which category we're looking at. We've got a terrestrial column and a marine column, and you can see that for the most part, there was a huge decrease in all the data sets that we looked at. So lots of different things were impacted negatively. And so with increase in mean temperature, heat waves are going to become much more frequent. And this has raised concern then, maybe we need to think about extreme heat and ecosystems. And that's why we're focusing on this. So are we underestimating recent and future mortality of biota from heat waves? So just briefly to highlight some key points, and these are thanks to Amanda Lindberger, who couldn't be here today, but she captured some key points from the prior March 18th seminar. Mike Crimmins highlighted the climatology, and 3 of his key points were different parts of the world are experiencing both warming and heat waves differently. Definitions of heat waves matter a lot because using a different heat wave related variable shows impacts in different locations. So there's many ways you can define a heat wave. And there's multiple recent papers that have focused on heat waves and extremes, including projections of extreme heat. So that's a growing area. Fisheries, Scott Bonar, who's affiliated with our department at University of Arizona and is also with USGS and is currently president of the American Fisheries Society. There are long lists of different kinds of impacts of heat and climate change on fisheries. They're seeing lots of effects that are escalating from species migration, coral bleaching, and other types of things. And some adaptation options exist, such as cooling streams or increased flows or propagation, but reducing our emissions directly through mitigation is really critical from Scott's perspective, and I certainly agree with that. In terms of insects, Katie Prudek, who is also with our department in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment, highlighted that insects have multiple forms of resilience, but are affected very differently by temperature in different seasons. Mass extinctions are usually in historical context, are unusual in historical context, but certain categories like pollinators are very susceptible to climate impacts. And third, there's a range of ways that heat affects the life cycles of different species and ecosystems. So a lot to think about in terms of that. And finally, Greg Garfin, with input from Dr. Vanos at Arizona State University, highlighted for human health that even though human health impacts of heat waves have been increasing in number, there's not enough data for policy prescriptions yet. And there's lots of adaptation options for humans that exist, especially since we have the capacity to predict and respond unlike other species. And there are acclimation issues and many other factors that affect heat-related mortality. So I posed some questions, and Greg is going to facilitate some discussion, and you're invited at the end to put in some questions to chat. But I just wanted to share the questions that we posed last time. How to determine heat wave sensitivities for biota and project future impacts. What's the best way to do that? Looking at evaluating implications of regional scale, multi-trophic synchronous impacts. So big, fast, hitting lots of things like I talked about in the Western Australia example. And then strategies for adapting to regional scale, multi-trophic synchronous impacts. How do we do that? That's a tough thing to deal with. And in our discussion, 2 additional questions came up. One was, what are post-disturbance event changes and what processes drive them? And what can be learned from knowledge about human mortality in response to heat waves? And the last one is a particularly good point, jumping off point to go to Dr. Robbie Berger's presentation, where he's going to focus on birds and mammals and kind of continue this conversation of thinking about extreme heat and ecosystems. And what we're really trying to do here is step back and take a broad multi-trophic level perspective and look, because we're concerned that, you know, the threshold for a lot of these different biota might be somewhat similar, and we might start exceeding these quite extensively and rapidly in the future. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Robbie.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay, just both an audio and a visual check here. Can everyone see my slide?
Yes, we can see your
Yes.
slide and we can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Greg, for the introduction, and Dave for recapping the previous talks and providing that segue here. Thanks to the organizers also for this webinar and all those that are joining us. So I'm going to be talking about thinking about lethal temperatures to life, and really what that, you know, sort of how we study lethal temperatures to life and what the implications are for understanding and predicting and adapting to extreme heat waves. Here's one example of flying foxes, a large-scale mortality event that occurred, I believe it's about 2 years ago in Australia. And these events are increasing in frequency, and I'll talk about flying foxes more as one of my case studies here. So just a bit about me. I'm a macroecologist, and so I'm interested in very general rules that govern biodiversity, even rules that can maybe even exhibit somewhat law-like behaviors, the very general pattern and processes about the diversity of life. And in addition to being a macroecologist, I'm very much an interdisciplinary scientist, and I really love the opportunity to work with the BBCS because I can use this framework in our understanding of general rules that govern biodiversity and apply them to a number of practical issues related to understanding human ecology, conservation of biodiversity, sustainability of the human socioeconomic system, and various aspects of global change. So if we know the general rules that govern life, we can begin to anticipate and predict what would happen in change events. And I largely study the diversity of mammals as well as birds. So I really think, you know, sort of my model system is 5,000 mammal species, roughly 10,000 birds. And in this context, I really think a lot about how humans compare to other species. And so trying to understand the uniqueness of the human ecology and the implications for understanding sort of the future of the human species from doing so. So here's what I'm going to talk about. I'll introduce a very general approach to sort of thinking about limits to life on Earth in terms of thermal limits and how we study those. I'll discuss some challenges for trying to predict the impacts of heat wave events. And then I'll end with a human example thinking about unique characteristics of the human species and our ability to incorporate extra metabolic energy, and I'll talk a bit more about this, and how it has allowed us to expand our human niche, and especially our thermal niche, and sort of what the insights are from that approach in thinking about thermoregulating on a hotter planet. So as a macroecologist, I sort of take a very macroscopic view of biology. And this is an image that was taken by the Cassini spacecraft as it was passing Saturn, looking back at Earth. And I think that, and this was sort of the focus of Carl Sagan's famous book entitled The Pale Blue Dot. And I think that this really reminds us and emphasizes just how delicate life really is in sort of the big scheme of things. And when it comes to temperature, there's an enormous range of variation in temperatures out there in the universe. Only a very small fraction of that is where life exists. And so that's what that looks like when we zoom into the pale blue dot. This is the temperature limits for life. And we can see that the focus of this paper was really thinking about the thermophiles, the species that do really well in hot temperatures. And so if we just look in the middle of this plot here at about 50 degrees, 122 degrees Fahrenheit, once we hit 50 degrees, we've already lost things like mosses, vascular plants, fish, insects, everything below the line. So we can sort of think about this as one sort of way to do a first cut way of thinking about if temperatures hit a certain threshold, what species would persist and what would the remaining ecosystems look. So essentially, once we get considerably hot, hotter than 50 degrees, we have some fungi and some algae and protozoans that can survive. And then we get into cyanobacteria and then these very specialized thermophilic archaea that persist in very extremely hot environments, all right? And so what we see here on this graph is that in terms of vertebrates, there are some data for fish. Certainly 50 degrees exceeds lethal limits for most fishes. But the terrestrial vertebrates are conspicuously missing from this plot. Okay, so birds and mammals, as well as reptiles and amphibians. And in the case of birds and mammals, and so this is sort of the first major take home from my talk here, is why are the birds and mammals not on this plot here? And it's simply because we don't know what their limits to life are, okay? Experimentally, we do not know what those thresholds look like, okay? And this is because of ethical reasons and so forth, and subjecting animals to these kinds of lethal experimentation. What we do know about birds and mammals largely comes from work that was pioneered by Scholander and others in the 1950s, where we know that most birds and mammals look something like this. They're really close to this. Okay, so this is a sort of general macroecological rule. On the x-axis, we have ambient temperature. On the y-axis, we have metabolic rate, so basically energy use or heat production. You can think of it in either of those sort of currencies. And what we see here, this is going to be crucial for the rest of my talk, so I want to walk you through this. So most birds and mammals, or basically essentially all birds and mammals, have a range of temperatures that are what's labeled here as the thermal neutral zone. So this is the range of environmental temperatures where metabolic rate, energy used to thermoregulate, is minimized. Okay, so RMR here just stands for resting metabolic rate. This is when organisms are comfortable in the temperatures that they're living in, and they're not using any additional energy to thermoregulate. When temperatures begin to decrease, the ambient temperature begins to decrease on the x-axis here, at some threshold, the lower critical temperature is when organisms begin to use energy to thermoregulate. So this is in the form of shivering in humans and a lot of other birds and mammals. And so as temperatures drop, we shiver to basically compensate for that decrease in temperature and to maintain our constant body temperature. Similarly, on the high end side here, there's an upper threshold, the TUC, where above this threshold, again, organisms begin to use additional energy to cool themselves. And this is where it's a bit counterintuitive, because on the right-hand side, it's getting hotter. And as it gets hotter, we're using more energy, producing more heat in order to cool ourselves. In humans, this comes in the form of perspiration, basically sweating to cool ourselves. A lot of birds and mammals pant to cool themselves, okay? So you have to use more energy on either side of this thermal neutral zone to thermoregulate. And this is the classic work that sort of initiated a lot of this. It was funded by the Navy. They focused on birds and mammals living in Barrow, Alaska, and Barrow, Colorado, Panama. Sort of trying to think about the extremes, although temperatures here in the Southwest certainly get much hotter than in Panama. And so this is sort of an updated plot that summarizes a lot of this kind of work. So for more than 50 years, following up on the Scholander model, various animal physiologists have conducted these experiments where they take animals and they put them in these cages, essentially, and they can dial up the temperature, dial down the temperature, and they can measure the metabolic rate through oxygen consumption or CO2 emission or other correlates, and they can sort of plot out these data. So generally what we see is that the Scholander model does accurately coincide with the empirical data. We see this sort of this bathtub shape relationship between heat production or energy use and environmental temperature. There's much more done on the cold side than on the warm side. There's fewer studies that raise temperature and see the response than sort of cooling down. And again, I think a lot of that is related to ethical issues in terms of doing these kinds of experiments. And so consequently, and this is what the focus of the Scholander model was, is that we have a pretty good handle on the cold side. There are basically these 4 parameters, and you can play around with this, but we understand adaptation to the cold side much better than the warm side. And this is all sort of the implication here is that body temperature is constant across species. So as temperature gets cool, you can see how various changes in C. So conductance here is basically just like the inverse of insulation. So you can sort of think about C as being related to insulation. The slope of C can change. And so we can think about various adaptations to cold, one being body size. Bigger animals can persist in colder temperatures, but also things like changes to C. So changes to your insulation can certainly change your lower temperatures that you can persist, as well as changes in metabolic rate independent of body size. So having a really high metabolic rate, producing a lot of heat relative to your size can allow you to persist in colder environments. So there has been a lot of focus on the cold side. And for a lot of reasons, because it's a lot simpler approach in that it requires few parameters to actually get a handle on the cold side here. And so we can't explain these various adaptations to cold environments. And here's a comparison across species again. I just want to highlight that for the birds and mammals that are on the right side. So this is the upper thermal limit. It's not the lethal limit. You can see it's certainly below 40 degrees for birds and mammals. And what's been pointed out in a number of studies now is that the variance in the upper critical temperatures is much smaller than the variance in colder temperatures. Birds and mammals and upper and lowers, but also across species, there's a lot more variance in the lower temperature than the hot. And there was a study that was published that was entitled Heat Freezes Evolution, looking at these sort of patterns, and their sort of conclusion or interpretation was that adaptation to hot environments is much more limited than adaptations to cold environments. Okay, so again, it seems to be more difficult to have different adaptations to warm environments, and we're actually able to study the responses to warm environments less so than the cold environments. All right, so it's not so simple to study the hot end of this graph, and certainly these approaches that are looking at where the TLC and the TUC occur are not capturing the lethal temperatures. And again, with birds and mammals, this seems to be sort of related to ethical issues related to doing these kinds of experiments, right? So we can think there's certainly some temperature out there on the right side where it reaches the lethal threshold. 42 degrees is one that we see with flying foxes that I'll talk a bit more about. And so here's the importance of understanding these lethal limits. So this is a paper that Dave and I and others are working on, where the blue bars here represent the historical records from Perth, Australia. So this is sort of the first half of the 20th century. And the red shows the latter half and into the 2000s. And this is only a 1 degree shift in the mean temperature between these two time periods. So this is just within the past century, a 1 degree shift. And the consequence here is, if you look at the tail over on the right, if we have a hypothetical lethal threshold, or this is one way to define a heat wave, is at 40.6 degrees C, just a shift in 1 degree in the mean temperature results in more than doubling the number of days that would exceed that threshold of 40.6 degrees, okay? So this is the importance of trying to understand heat waves. And so I'll talk more about some of the challenges here. So here are the data for these physiological tests that have been synthesized across much of life. It was published a couple of years ago in one of Nature's journals. They compiled data for more than 2,560 across 200 different orders, across ecosystems, marine or tidal, freshwater, terrestrial. You can see those points there, the distribution of where these studies occur from. Some, terrestrial, pretty good representation globally, certainly lacking in parts of the tropics. And what's interesting is, so I dived into this data set and have been digging around in here to actually understand, what data do we actually experimentally have that show lethal temperatures. And for the vertebrates, there's about 50 fish species. A lot of these are of commercial value. And this certainly is with the talk in the last series on fish. There's one fact that there's for 2 snakes and 0 birds and mammals. Again, we just, for the past 50 years or more since Showlander, we do not take these experimental temperature tests to those lethal limits for a variety of ethical issues. So how can we predict the impacts of heat waves if we don't know what these lethal limits are? Okay, this seems to be really, sort of missing information if we want to get a handle on doing some future projections. And this group in Australia, I think, has come up with a really cool way where they've been studying these flying foxes. Their mass mortality during heat events is very conspicuous. One of the things, and there's pretty good records in Australia, the heat wave impacts in terms of mortalities has actually moved further south in Australia with time, and that's sort of away from the equator. So the places are getting warmer further south. And one of the things, these are data from a heat wave that occurred in the early 2000s, where more than, or I guess it's 30 or so flying fox colonies throughout Eastern Australia were being monitored. And so here is the, if 42 is in fact the lethal threshold, this is what they found in terms of the colonies that would have been impacted, okay? And so there is good evidence that those are the colonies that were in fact suffered mortality thresholds. Certainly other colonies that were being monitored that did not exceed that threshold seem to be okay, all right? And so what's cool about this is they turn this into this forecasting approach where they combine the weather forecast, and they know where these colonies are. So the black points here are the various colonies that they're monitoring. And this provides a means to basically forecast when you would expect to have heat waves that would reach these lethal thresholds and where you might have mass die-offs in these colonies. It's not just one species in Australia. And I guess the other thing I should mention here is that these bats, the flying foxes in Australia, do really well in urban environments, in city parks, and agricultural areas. So, so these species and these mortality events are actually occurring when there's hotter temperatures, but presumably these animals have access to water because they're in these environments where there are things like golf courses and lakes and water around agriculture and so forth. So it doesn't seem to be, a compounding effect of drought and heat. We certainly see heat waves occurring with domesticated species as well. In the Central Valley of California, in 2017, there was a heat wave that resulted in 5,000 or so livestock in the Central Valley. 2006, there was also a heat wave, estimated $300 million in loss in the cattle industry. And one single county in Kings County alone, $3.7 million lost from dairy cows as a consequence of one heat wave, right? So these impacts are huge when it comes to economics, and certainly related to food security issues too, since a lot of the United States is fed from the Central Valley of California. Here's an example from the UK in 2019, just last year, a major heat wave, lots of chickens dying, and the temperature was only, this news release here says the temperature exceeded 38°C, so it's not getting that hot there. But one of the things that I've noticed, it seems that chickens do have a slightly lower thermal tolerance than some of the mammals. And the other issue is the location of this heat wave is much more humid, and there is an interaction between the humidity and the lethal temperature, which I'll mention again at the end of my talk. So I think one future direction here is we don't have the lethal limits for any birds and mammals from experimentation, but we do know when these mass die-offs occur, if we know the temperatures that were exceeded during these mass die-off events, can we use those temperatures to develop forecasting approaches similar to the Flying Fox lab in Australia? So I think this is one of the studies that I'm interested in developing, and I'm very interested in hearing your feedback on that kind of approach. So the last section here will focus on humans and really thinking about the unique technologies that have allowed human thermal niche expansion and therefore sort of human niche expansion generally. So getting some insights into why humans, or sort of, you know, how humans have become the most dominant species on the planet. So I'll come back to the Showlander model here. And now I've put human data on this plot. So our body temperature is about 37 C, or it's not about, it's sort of precisely 37 C when you're healthy, 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Our lower and upper critical temperatures are 25 and 30 degrees. So it's pretty narrow in comparison to other mammal species. And this is, you know, without using additional technologies and clothing. And so our resting metabolic rate is about 100 watts. So that's roughly 2,000 calories a day, okay? So that's what our thermal profile looks. Here again is the other mammal species where this has been investigated. And there's the humans in comparison in the lower right. And here are data, okay? So here's a really, I think, very clever extension of the Showlander model to accommodate modern humans. These are data by Dick Hill and others at Michigan State in collaboration with a lab at McGill in Canada, where these are 6 different cities across North America. And each point here represents the household energy use for a given day and the temperature for that day, okay? So you basically have 365 days for most of these, and you get the full energy use profile for a given household in these different cities through a course of a year. And what's cool about this is you sort of see the emergence of the Showlander pattern, where our household energy use is just an extension of our sort of physiology, all right? And so this is an example of what I sort of refer to as understanding the extra metabolic energy sort of subsidies that have allowed the human niche to really expand. And in this study, again, there was a focus on the cold end because it's a bit easier to understand. And so they were able to understand just how different technologies in terms of clothing technologies actually influence this curve. So something, you know, both pushes the lower critical temperature down as well as it changes the slope of that conductance curve. So something like a double caribou pelt allows you to persist in minus 40 degree temperatures, all right? And do that comfortably, all right? So what we don't, and so here are those data for the different cities just plotted together now. And you see that there are a couple of hot cities in Florida, Kissimmee, Key West, one Arizona city here, Flagstaff, which is relatively high elevation. And you can see that the TNZ, sort of the bottom of this curve here, you know, we sort of get the signature there, and we begin to get the uptick on the hot side with the Florida cities and also this city in Alabama. Flagstaff is high enough elevation to where they don't really get the uptick on the right side. They don't necessarily have to use air conditioning in the summer yet. And so the question here is there seems to be a gap in these data, and I've talked to Dick Hill, I think, joining us on the Zoom here. The data for the Arizona city seems to be really important to understanding how household energy use to thermoregulate is going to change with increasing temperatures. And so here's just an example, I think, of the importance of focusing on Arizona cities in particular. So these are data from NASA in this article that the New York Times covered using data from NASA. And they looked at from 1991 to 2010, days above 100 degrees. So Phoenix has about 92 days, probably close to one of the highest in the US during that time period. You can certainly see the Southwest, the borderlands along the Rio Grande Valley, sort of South Central United States for the areas that have previously hit these really high summer temperatures. And here's a projection for 2100, okay? So Phoenix now reaching 163 days that exceed 100 degrees. And so the point being that I think that there's a lot of opportunity to focus on the Southwest hot cities and to understand this relationship between energy use and increasing hot temperatures in order to make projections for not only the Southwest, but a lot of the country. So we can even extend this globally and begin thinking about what's the sort of energy demand to thermoregulate globally as temperatures increase. And this is one of my last slides here. There is an interaction between temperature and humidity. And so the point being that when it's really humid, the temperature threshold, mortality threshold is actually lower. So it doesn't have to get as hot before you start hitting that threshold. And physiologically, this is pretty straightforward. Your body's using energy to sweat and try to cool yourself down. But if the air is already saturated with water, you have high humidity, the sweat that you're producing isn't evaporating. And so you reach those thermal limits at a much lower temperature. In the Southwest, so a lot of our hot AZ cities could be down here. Again, not capturing a lot of the data there, but we could certainly see higher temperatures than places like the Southeast without reaching those mortality thresholds. So I guess that's some encouraging news, maybe locally, but something to sort of, I think needs to be developed much better because we're missing some of these data. So in terms of understanding energy use and what it's going to look like in a hotter planet, this is sort of where I'm going. How can we use data from Arizona cities to make these future projections? How can this, what sort of inequalities come out here? I think this is a really important intersection for policy. Given certain temperature thresholds for projections, do we begin to subsidize energy use so that people can basically stay alive? All right. I think very important things for policy to consider. So just to wrap up, when it comes to the birds and mammals, we don't have lethal temperatures experimentally, but we do have these occurrences of these heat wave events and mortalities. Can we begin to use the temperature known from those events to develop forecasting approaches to anticipate other large-scale mortalities from heat waves? So very similar to the flying fox, but extended to other wildlife as well as domesticated species. For humans, we don't have good data on household energy use in response to really hot temperatures. So I think Arizona cities, as well as cities throughout the Southwest, parts of the Borderlands, are really important to understanding this energy response to hot temperatures in terms of how we cool our local environment. And also the implications coming from that in terms of what does this mean for human health? And again, inequalities associated with how we actually cope to adapting to increased heat waves. And I'll just end here. I am currently looking for 2 students to help with this kind of research. So if you know any good students, they have to be undergraduates at the University of Arizona, but please forward my information to them. And I'm very excited about pursuing some of these projects. So thanks for your time, and I'll be glad to take any questions.
Thanks, Robbie. So I would encourage people to submit questions. There's a Q&A box if you hover your mouse over the bottom strip of the Zoom screen, and you can send your questions to Q&A. If you send them to chat, we will not penalize you. And I see there's already a comment and question from Barbara Hutchinson. So the question is, don't you also get declines in air qualities along with heat in cities, so that deaths may occur to that as well as just the straight heat? Do either of you want to respond to that?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And yeah, I think that just sort of reveals, you know, the challenge in some of these problems is that it is so multidimensional. And if you're not thinking about one thing, there's, you know, if you're sort of focused on one aspect, then there's other things that could certainly play into this. So that's a very good point. And maybe there's, so I guess there could be deaths from the air quality or some sort of interaction between the air quality plus the heat that could go on there.
Yeah. And that's
that's
something, go ahead.
Oh, no, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's an active area of research in climate and public health about those kinds of interactions. And also, as we're seeing with COVID-19, interactions between the stressor, in this case heat, and pre-existing conditions, whether those are lung or cardiovascular kinds of things as well. We've got another question here. This one: have lethal thermal limits for oak or non-conifer species been identified?
I can speak to that, Greg. I'm pretty sure they haven't. We have two different areas of research sort of headed in this direction. One is the paper that Robbie mentioned that we're working on together with some others, that is sort of an opinion piece, and it's going to highlight that we aren't thinking about heat waves enough in terms of plants, and sort of have a call to arms for some quick trials of different types of experiments where we try and find out some of these thresholds. We're currently working on a study where we're asking if temperature, if a heat wave imposed upon a base temperature or imposed upon a warmer temperature accelerates mortality. But there's a whole series of questions that are maybe more related to yours, that you could increase a temperature progressively experimentally, at least for seedlings and saplings. It's possible, but logistically difficult to do it for full-size trees. But no, I don't think that has been identified, and I think that's a key issue.
Thanks. Another question: did any of these studies show how heat had effects on reptiles like turtles or snakes?
Yeah, so the data synthesis paper that I mentioned that had over 2,000 species, there are two reptiles where there are lethal temperatures recorded, and I believe it's two colubrid snakes. I think one of them is like a whip snake or a masticophis. So anyhow, if you're interested in those data, you can check out that paper, send me an email, and I can send it to you. But as far as I know, only two species of snakes were included in that, or that they, that was sort of a summary of all the literature that's been published. So they only had two examples of where there was experimentation for 2 snake species.
Okay, thanks. Another question here is asking, I guess this is aimed at Robbie, what's the method of death? Dehydration, respiratory system damage, and so on.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know the straightforward answer offhand. And it would be interesting. So I guess I'm not like an experimental physiologist, so I haven't done these kinds of experiments myself. But it would be interesting to look through these studies to see if that is reported. You know, if they know the actual sort of mechanism. And I guess yeah, I mean, it's probably going to vary considerably across taxa. But I mean, the question about dehydration is interesting because I suspect that in many of these experimental situations, they are trying to rule that out. But I don't know for sure. In other words, you know, they have captive animals. They could be wild animals that they bring into captivity, but they're in sort of controlled environments when they do the experiment to try to manipulate just temperature and see the response and not have confounding factors.
Thanks, Robbie. A question for Dave. Could you talk about any potential feedbacks between tree die-off and the resilience or susceptibility to future heat waves?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think we have very good information on that. I think what it first makes me think about is that I'm used to thinking about tree die-off from drought and warmer temperatures, and then the subsequent ecosystem consequences of that. And I think it's quite different if you start thinking about, oh, multiple organisms are, in multiple trophic levels are being hit all at once. And, I think potentially that would reduce resilience more than sort of the other way of thinking about it in terms of, well, you have a tree die-off event, there's secondary effects. But I think it's an area that really that's the purpose of this dialogue, is to start getting us to ask some of these tough questions and start thinking about them, because I think it's really been out of the wheelhouse. I guess one of the things I would have mentioned with a little more time at the beginning is, it's well known in all these assessments that heat waves are causing a lot of human mortality in cities under big events. And so it's not surprising, but it's almost completely undocumented, or it's not very well considered in, for example, recent climate assessment reports. So I think heat waves are a big overlooked thing. I think they probably do influence future resilience, but I don't think we have any data yet to really tell us about that.
Thanks, Dave. There are 3 or 4 or 5 more questions. So if Dave and Robbie, if you're willing to hang in there, then we can continue to answer questions. But I want to just mention that we've reached our hour. So any participants who'd like to sign off, feel free to do that. And I'll just say now, because I might not get a chance later, to thank Dave and Robbie for their presentations and for answers to these questions. And before we come back to the questions, I just wanted to share one thing with folks, and that is that I just wanted to mention that we have these upcoming webinars. You can see the URL here, www.swcasc.arizona.edu/webinars. Coming up next week, 2 sessions on ecosystem transformation after large-scale disturbance, and then on May 12th, a webinar on Native American cultural burning. So getting back to, did I not share that? Okay, anyway, getting back to the question.
It didn't come through, Greg.
It didn't come through, okay. So
Looks like it's
now,
coming now.
now I'm sharing it.
Yes.
Okay, here's the URL. We've got this ecosystem transformation next week, May 5th and 6th from 1 to 3 Pacific, and then on May 12th from 1 to 2 Pacific, Native American cultural burning. So let's go back to the questions if you two are willing to hang in there.
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, so focusing again on the Q&A box, this is from Steve Astoya. What do we know about heat thresholds where animals are non or minimally functional but not dead? In other words, still able to survive, but so stressed that they cannot perform activities such as seed dispersal, pollination, lactation in cows, and so on. Heat stress could compromise their role in ecosystem function or toward food security. So what do we know about when they're not dead, but they're just sort of hanging in there?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think that's a very good point. So a lot of the experimental studies, when they don't go to lethal temperatures, they do look at various performance metrics, which are really informative. And so, you know, for lizards, it could be things like, you know, sprint speeds and things like that, or various sort of physiological performance outputs. For domesticated animals, there have been some studies that have looked at things like lactation or biomass production in terms of like egg production and chickens. So those are certainly have been investigated, and I think that there certainly has been a lot more work that's been done on that, and also with crops too, looking at sort of the performance of crops, sublethal performance in crops, and we've incorporated a good deal of that in the paper with Dave. So I don't know if Dave, you want to mention anything about sort of sublethal performance metrics.
Yeah, we've been trying to look at that, and I guess similar to Katie Brudick's comment about insects and all the different aspects in which temperature influences things. There's limited data on this from sort of a plant ecology perspective. You know, there's a lot more in the crop data where growth or sort of metrics related to crop production, but prior to mortality kick in. I think in general, we don't have very good information for that for, you know, for our wildland ecosystems, I would say.
Okay, great. Thanks. Another question here is, in the Sonoran Desert, is there anything as dramatic as the flying fox die-off during heat waves? And I'm guessing that the person who submitted this question is referring to dramatic in terms of mammal or bird die-off.
Yeah, that's a good question. And not to my knowledge. I think, so one person that has specifically been doing a lot of work in the Sonoran Desert on this topic with birds is Blair Wolf's lab at the University of New Mexico. So he might, it's possible that some of his work has discussed specific species, but I'm not aware of any large-scale die-offs that's comparable to the flying fox situation. You know, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not happening, it's just going undetected, but I'm not aware of any specific species. Maybe others are more knowledgeable on that topic than I am. I have only been here for 6 months or so.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have anything to add to that one.
Okay. A question here. Does the research into heat waves and species thermal limits lead you into thinking about the link between heat waves and wildfires and resulting species mortality? Can you speak to the heat wildfire connection if this is something your research leads you to think about?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question because it just gets to the heart of what we're trying to think about. And I personally have been thinking a lot more specifically, you know, about drought, extended drought, warmer average temperature causing trees to die. And this has made me think, at least with the West Australia example of all those types of mortality across different trophic levels of how big things can get hit quickly. And of course, that temperature is also the same temperature that's driving wildfire risk and you know, different fuels metrics. And I think the important thing is, well, we've got a lot of variation location to location. You know, at a global scale, the metric that we're most confident in terms of changing is temperature. And so we know temperature is going up, and just as Robbie highlighted, you know, the shift in that 1 degree C in Perth ended up in doubling the number of days over a given threshold. And I think those types of very high thresholds apply to all of these things. Like, you know, it could trigger tree mortality. It definitely would, I would expect it would increase wildfire risk. And it can also hit these thresholds where, you know, we can have flying foxes or penguins or endangered cockatoos all dying or losing breeding success or things like that. So it's a great question. And I think it's just where we're trying to kind of start thinking about and start weaving those threads together.
Thanks, Dave. Let's do one more question. This one is in the southeast, the Gulf Coast area. We're losing high numbers of marine mammals due to warmer water and higher morbidity, and that human impacts from extremely high temperatures, over 95 degrees Fahrenheit plus over 95% humidity. Is regional policy a solution? So again, it's in the Gulf Coast area in the US, losing high numbers of marine mammals due to warmer water, higher morbidity, high humidity. So regional policy, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that this is related to one of the latter graphs that I showed with the interaction between humidity and temperature and sort of the mortality threshold for humans. And so, you know, that does show that the lethal mortality is likely at a lower temperature when the humidity is higher. And so I think that certainly does suggest implications for regional policy. So for example, the same mortality threshold and temperature, you know, if you were to do some forecasting and for, you know, heat waves, that threshold is going to be very different for the Southeast. It's going to be lower for the Southeast. And presumably that also has consequences for other species, but that example that I showed earlier is specific for humans. But I do think that that interaction between temperature and humidity certainly does have implications for regional policy, and that the same, you know, the lethal thresholds that you would use for the dry Southwest would be very different from humid areas.
Thanks, Robbie. So I acknowledge that there are several other questions. We are, we will, you know, at least record those questions, and we can send them to Dave and Robbie. And if they have time, perhaps they can aim to send you answers. And I just want to mention that before we sign off, that just following this webinar, when you sign off, there'll be a survey. We would be really grateful if you would answer. It's a real quick survey. It'll help us to improve future webinars. And I'd like to thank everyone for their attention, great questions, and thank Dave and Robbie again for fantastic presentations and really good insights into answers to these very challenging questions. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Greg.
Right.
Thank you, and thank everyone for attending. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Stay healthy, everyone. We'll be back next week with the event on landscape managing in the, after landscape transformation, and in 2 weeks, cultural burning webinar. Thank you.
Hi, Dave, I'm here. And I realized that I sent my link on the webinars just to the panelists. I meant to send it to everybody, but
Okay, okay. Good, well, that works for me. Robbie, are you still on?
no, it looks like Robbie signed off.
Okay.
I guess-
Greg, you're on?
Yes.
Okay, any feedback? Was that, I mean, certainly it seemed to generate interest. You know, I don't know how applied it is, but it also is sort of, it's like on the cutting edge of, we know this stuff's really important, and we have a really big black box here. So I don't know, feedback from either of you?
I think it went great. We got lots of interest and lots of questions. I don't think we've ever gotten that many questions before. So people were really engaged for sure. And it's a very, like you said, it's an interesting topic, right? Because there's a lot of still open areas with it. So.
Thanks.
Yeah, you know, I think we, you know, probably could have yeah. You know, I'm really,
I didn't intend for my talk to go so long, so there wasn't quite as much discussion time, but we certainly had we had more discussion on this one than we did on the last one because the other one ran so long.
Yeah, and you know, definitely a super interesting set of topics.
Mhm.
And
Go ahead, Greg.
yeah, no, I lost my train of thought there.
So Dave, the last two questions, you can see the Q&A, right? So there's one from Mara Kay and one from, I don't know how to pronounce, Sharish, maybe?
Yeah.
Do you want me to send those, are those answer questions you can answer, or should I send them to both you and Robbie? And
Why don't you send them to both me and Robbie? I think Robbie will probably take on both of those.
Okay, and I'll send you their email addresses as well so that he can.
Okay, yeah, yeah. That's good. Well, good. Thank you. For me, it was a really nice opportunity to just kind of continue
Mhm.
to raise this as an area of concern and get people thinking about it. And I think for me, it's there's a lot more questions than there are answers, but it's also pretty clear that, you know, Houston, we have a problem here. So
Yeah, you know, the one thing that I would have liked to see, given that there were so many questions in this area, it would have been really great to also have a public health researcher to talk more about those interactions between pollution and duration of heat events and what happens during the onset and all that sort of stuff.
yeah,
But you know, I think the two of you really illuminated a lot of the issues and knowledge gaps, and that was definitely worth my time.
yeah. Well, I'm learning a lot from Robbie. I mean, I just sort of stumbled into it like with this. I mean, it was mostly like a review paper of additional cases. So I just feel like it's important, but I don't feel like I know very much about it yet. So anyway, but good. I'm glad we got it out there, and I'm glad, I'm shocked the attendance was that good. So that's great.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for all the prep and for spending the time and answering the tough questions.
Yep.
And
Yeah. Sarah, would you mind just sending me an email with any summary stats on like how many people attended or whatever? Just it's something for me to stick in like a NSF report later when, you know, like how much did I work on communicating things?
Yeah, for sure. And do you want a list of the questions too?
Sure, may as well. Yeah, but mostly I just need like numbers of attendance or whatever, how, you know, stuff like that.
It's out a sheet with all that info.
Perfect, perfect. That would be great.
Okay.
Well, thank you. You made this run smoothly, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Dave.
thank you. I know I'll be seeing you again soon, and
Okay,
definitely,
great.
definitely
And we'll be
emailing.
Yep, we'll be emailing. Okay, things are rolling. Again, my apologies that thing is such a short fuse, but I think we're on track now. So.
Yeah, good. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and I'm excited about it, and excited about the what I hope is a good probability. So.
okay. Great.
All right.
All right. Take
Talk
care.
to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.